Some lives end loudly, marked by headlines, memorials, and clear answers, but some lives disappear so quietly that the absence itself becomes the mystery. This is one of those stories, a story where music history slowly fades into silence, where fame does not protect a person from being forgotten, and where freedom becomes so complete that it erases identity. Tonight, on Hidden Truth, we are uncovering the documented yet unresolved disappearance of a woman who once stood on one of the most famous stages in the world, whose voice blended into the sound of a generation, and whose name still echoes through folk music history. Her name is Christina Licorice McKechnie, a Scottish musician, poet, singer, and songwriter, whose whereabouts have remained publicly unknown for decades. Welcome to Hidden Truth, a channel created to uncover real stories that history left unfinished and uncomfortable. If you believe that some mysteries deserve careful attention, and if you believe that real lives deserve more than footnotes, then subscribe to Hidden Truth now, because every story we tell is researched, documented, and narrated to keep the truth alive. This is not just a story about a missing person. It is the story of a young woman who rejected ordinary life from the very beginning. It is the story of love that arrived too early and ended too painfully. It is the story of artistic success that never brought stability. And it is the story of a human being who slowly stepped away from society until there was nothing left to follow but rumor and memory. As this documentary unfolds, you will hear about poetry readings in dim folk clubs, about relationships that shape music history, about a performance at Woodstock that placed her among legends, and about a final period of life marked by instability, freedom, and silence. With every chapter, the facts remain clear, but the meaning behind them becomes more unsettling. Was Licorice McKechnie a victim of circumstance, a casualty of mental illness, or a woman who consciously chose to disappear? Stay with Hidden Truth until the very end, because what begins as a musical biography slowly transforms into a mystery that has never been fully explained. Christina McKechnie was born on 2 October 1945 in Edinburgh, Scotland, a city known for its deep literary traditions, its historic streets, and its long relationship with art and rebellion. Edinburgh, in the mid-20th century, was a place where old values existed alongside emerging countercultures, and it was within this tension that Christina began to form her identity. From an early age, she showed signs of emotional sensitivity, creative intensity, and a restless spirit that resisted conventional expectations. Those who later knew her described her as thoughtful, intense, and often distant, even in social settings. She was drawn toward poetry and music not as hobbies, but as essential forms of expression. Words mattered deeply to her, and sound was not entertainment but communication. As a teenager, Christina became a regular presence in Edinburgh folk clubs, small venues where aspiring musicians and poets gathered to share ideas rather than chase fame. These spaces were informal but deeply personal, filled with acoustic instruments, handwritten lyrics, and audiences that listened carefully rather than applauded loudly. It was in these rooms that Christina began reading her poetry aloud, gaining quiet recognition for writing that felt personal, emotional, and searching. It was also during this period that she acquired the nickname Licorice, a name that reflected her complex personality. Licorice was sweet yet bitter, distinctive, and impossible to ignore, much like the woman herself. Over time, this nickname replaced her given name within creative circles, becoming the identity she carried into music history. Among the people who noticed her during this period was Robin Williamson, a musician who would later become a central figure in the incredible string band. Williamson recognized something unusual in Licorice, not just talent, but emotional depth and a willingness to live outside boundaries. Their connection grew naturally within the folk scene, where personal relationships and creative collaboration often overlapped. However, before this relationship fully developed, Licorice made a life-changing decision that revealed how intensely she followed her emotions. In her teenage years, she left home with the intention of marrying folk guitarist Bert Jansch, who was already becoming a respected figure in British folk music. The wedding banns were formally published, a public declaration that suggested permanence and commitment. Yet the marriage never took place. In 1963, Bert Jansch left Scotland to travel to Morocco, pursuing personal freedom and artistic exploration, leaving Licorice behind without resolution. This abandonment deeply affected her, emotionally and psychologically, and marked one of the first major ruptures in her personal life. According to Robin Williamson, this moment brought Licorice closer to him, both emotionally and romantically. He later described how she fell into his arms after Jansch left, seeking comfort, connection, and stability. This relationship would soon extend beyond personal support and into creative partnership. By 1967, Williamson invited Licorice to join his musical project, the Incredible String Band, which at that time consisted of Williamson himself and Mike Herron. The band was already gaining attention for its experimental folk sound, blending traditional instruments with unconventional themes and structures. Licorice was asked to join not as a lead performer but as a vocalist and percussionist, contributing texture and harmony rather than dominance. Her first recorded contribution came in the form of backing vocals on the song Painting Box, which appeared on the album The 5,000 Spirits or The Layers of the Onion. Although her role was subtle, it added a distinct layer to the band's sound, one that listeners would later recognize as essential rather than decorative. By 1968, Licorice was regarded as a full member of the Incredible String Band. She regularly performed as a backing singer and percussionist, both in studio recordings and live performances. Her presence on stage was quiet but magnetic, and those who watched her perform often described a sense of emotional distance combined with deep focus. As the band's popularity grew, so did the scale of their performances. In August 1969, the Incredible String Band performed at the Woodstock Festival, one of the most iconic events in music history. Licorice stood on that stage before an enormous crowd, participating in a moment that would later define an entire cultural era. Despite this achievement, she never appeared to embrace fame. She did not seek attention, interviews, or recognition beyond the music itself. Instead, she remained a background presence, contributing quietly while the world focused on louder figures. During this period, Licorice also began writing her own songs. One of her compositions, titled I Know You, was recorded by the band and appeared on their 1970 double album titled You. The song reflected emotional vulnerability, intimacy, and a sense of searching that mirrored her personal experiences. While creative output continued, personal tension was building beneath the surface. Licorice's relationship with Robin Williamson became increasingly strained, affected by emotional intensity, personal differences, and unresolved trauma from earlier relationships. The same qualities that fueled her creativity also made stability difficult to maintain. By 1972, both the romantic relationship and her involvement with the Incredible String Band came to an end. Her departure from the band was not dramatic or publicly explained. There were no farewell statements, no transition into another major project, and no attempt to maintain public visibility. Instead, Licorice stepped away from the most prominent chapter of her life at a moment when many would have clung to success. This decision puzzled those who knew her, but it was consistent with a pattern of rejecting conventional paths in favor of personal freedom. Her exit marked the beginning of a period defined by movement, instability, and increasingly limited documentation. While she would continue to appear in musical contexts, the clear structure of her earlier life began to dissolve. The woman who once stood at Woodstock was now moving quietly through the margins of the music world, and with every step away from visibility, the record of her life grew thinner. Her disappearance had not yet occurred, but the conditions that made it possible were already in place. The story of Licorice McKechnie was moving toward silence, one decision at a time. When Licorice McKechnie walked away from the Incredible String Band in 1972, she did not walk into obscurity immediately, but she did step into a life without clear direction, structure, or protection. For most artists, leaving a successful band would be followed by solo projects, interviews, or attempts to remain visible, but Licorice chose a different path, one marked by movement rather than stability. In the years that followed, she continued to appear in music, but always on the edges, never at the center, as if she was intentionally avoiding permanence. In 1974, she appeared on stage at a Church of Scientology concert in East Grinstead, England, performing alongside musicians such as Mike Garson and Woody Woodmansey. This appearance raised questions among those who followed her career, as it suggested she was searching for meaning beyond music, possibly drawn to belief systems that promised clarity and belonging. Shortly after this period, Licorice moved to California, a place that had long attracted artists who wanted to escape their pasts and reinvent themselves. California represented freedom, distance, and anonymity, and for Licorice, it offered a fresh beginning, far away from the folk scene that once defined her. There, she joined the Silver Moon Band, continuing to perform while remaining largely unnoticed by the mainstream music industry. During this time, she married musician Brian Lambert, a relationship that initially appeared to offer stability and companionship. However, the marriage eventually ended in divorce, reinforcing a pattern in Licorice's life where connections formed deeply but rarely lasted. According to Lambert, their relationship was shaped by her emotional complexity and her growing struggles with mental health. Despite these challenges, Licorice did not completely sever ties with her past. In 1977, she appeared again with Robin Williamson and his merry band, reconnecting briefly with the music world that first gave her recognition. On the album Journey's Edge, she was credited under the name Licky Lambert, a subtle indication of how her identity continued to shift and fragment over time. She later joined Woody Woodmansey's band called U-Boat, remaining active musically but never fully committing to a single place or project. Her life during this period was marked by movement, short engagements, and a visible resistance to routine. Behind the scenes, however, her struggles were becoming more serious. Brian Lambert later revealed that Licorice suffered from mental health conditions, including schizophrenia, which deeply affected her perception of reality and her relationship with society. Rather than seeking long-term treatment or structured care, Licorice made a decision that shocked those close to her. At one point, she consciously chose to live without a permanent home. This was not a sudden fall into homelessness, but a deliberate rejection of conventional living. She slept in vacant lots, took occasional waitress jobs to earn money, and moved freely without attachments or obligations. Lambert described finding her asleep behind his house at one point, not distressed or afraid, but calm and accepting of her situation. To those around her, this choice was deeply troubling, but to Licorice, it appeared to be an expression of control in a world that often overwhelmed her. Her rejection of stability extended beyond housing and relationships. She avoided consistent communication, rarely maintained long-term contact, and gradually withdrew from the social networks that might have kept track of her. By the early 1980s, Licorice was increasingly difficult to locate, even for those who cared about her. She moved frequently, avoided documentation, and lived in ways that left little record. Each decision created more distance between her and the life she once lived. In 1986, Licorice returned briefly to Edinburgh to visit her family. This visit was significant, as it represented one of the last confirmed moments when she was seen by people who knew her well. After this visit, information about her whereabouts became fragmented and unreliable. According to her sister, Licorice was in Sacramento, California, around 1990, recovering from surgery. After that, communication stopped completely. There were no letters, no confirmed phone calls, and no verifiable sightings. Music journalist Mark Ellen later wrote that Licorice was last seen hitchhiking across the Arizona desert in 1987. This image, a former Woodstock performer standing on a desert highway with her thumb out, became one of the most haunting details of her story. Former bandmate Rose Simpson later acknowledged the frightening uncertainty surrounding Licorice's fate, stating that there was a possibility she may be dead. Yet no evidence ever confirmed this conclusion. Brian Lambert, however, offered a different interpretation years later. He revealed that Licorice wanted a completely new life, one detached from her past, her name, and her history. According to him, her disappearance may not have been accidental, but intentional. This possibility complicates the narrative. If Licorice chose to disappear, then the absence of answers becomes part of the answer itself. By the time the 1990s arrived, Licorice McKechnie had effectively vanished from public record. No official closure followed. No final explanation emerged. What remained was a growing silence, filled with speculation, concern, and unanswered questions. Her life after fame had become invisible. And with that invisibility, the mystery of her disappearance deepened beyond recovery. The woman who once sang to thousands had become a shadow that history could no longer follow. And as the years passed, that shadow only grew longer. By the late 1980s, Christina Licorice McKechnie had reached a stage in her life where visibility no longer seemed important and perhaps no longer felt safe or necessary. The woman who once lived inside music communities, creative circles, and public performances had slowly transformed into someone who moved quietly through the world, leaving almost no trace behind. This change did not happen suddenly, and it did not begin with a single dramatic decision, but rather unfolded over many years through repeated choices that favored freedom over stability and distance over connection. Licorice had spent much of her adult life resisting structure, whether it came from fame, relationships, housing, or professional expectations. After leaving the incredible string band, she never again allowed herself to be anchored to a single identity or place for long. Each move, each short-term collaboration, and each rejection of routine pulled her further away from the version of life most people recognize as secure. By this stage, the patterns were clear to those who knew her well. Licorice avoided permanence. She avoided long-term commitments. She avoided systems that required documentation, accountability, or explanation. Her final confirmed visit to Edinburgh in 1986 stands out as a powerful moment in this slow withdrawal. she returned to the city where her life began, where her family still lived, and where her earliest creative dreams were formed. This visit suggests reflection, because people rarely return to their origins without reason. She met with family members, people who knew her before music, before relationships defined her path, and before the fractures of adulthood shaped her choices. What was discussed during that visit has never been made public, but its importance lies in the fact that it happened at all. It may have been a farewell, or it may have been a moment of grounding before she stepped away permanently. After this visit, Licorice returned to the United States, and from that point onward, the details of her life become uncertain and scattered. According to her sister, Licorice was in Sacramento, California, around 1990, where she was reportedly recovering from surgery. This account is one of the last pieces of information provided by someone close to her and remains one of the final confirmed references to her existence. After that moment, communications stopped entirely. There were no letters sent. There were no confirmed telephone calls. There were no reliable sightings shared by family or friends. This silence did not arrive with an announcement or a final message. It simply appeared and never lifted. Music journalist Mark Ellen later wrote that Licorice was last seen in 1987 hitchhiking across the Arizona desert. Although this detail does not come from official records, it has been repeated widely because of how strongly it captures the spirit of her disappearance. The image of a former Woodstock performer standing alone on a desert highway represents the distance between who she once was and who she may have become. Hitchhiking itself suggests movement without destination, trust in strangers, and acceptance of uncertainty. It aligns with everything Licorice had chosen in the years leading up to her disappearance. It also exposes a person to significant danger, especially for someone living without consistent medical care or support. Former Incredible string band member Rose Simpson later acknowledged the uncertainty surrounding Licorice's fate, openly stating that there was a possibility she may be dead. This statement was not an accusation or a conclusion, but an honest expression of fear shared by those who had no answers. Yet years later, a different perspective emerged that reshaped how her disappearance could be understood. Brian Lambert, Licorice's former husband, revealed information he had kept private for many years. In an interview recorded long after her disappearance, he explained that Licorice wanted a completely new life. According to Lambert, this desire was not impulsive or temporary. It was something she expressed clearly and repeatedly. She wanted to exist without the weight of her past, her name, her career, or the expectations placed upon her. Her mental health struggles played a major role in this desire. She suffered from schizophrenia, a condition that affects perception, thought patterns, and emotional regulation. For Licorice, this condition made structured society feel overwhelming and restrictive. Lambert explained that Licorice did not become homeless through force, abandonment, or failure. She chose it. She made a conscious decision to live without a permanent home, without routine, and without accountability. She slept in vacant lots. She worked occasional waitress jobs when she needed money. She moved freely without attachment to possessions or places. To many people, this life would feel frightening and unsafe. To Licorice, it represented control and autonomy in a world that often felt unbearable. Lambert described finding her asleep behind his house at one point, calm and untroubled. She was not distressed. She was not angry. She was not asking for help. She appeared at peace with the life she had chosen. This revelation forces a difficult and uncomfortable question. If Licorice chose this path intentionally, then was her disappearance a tragedy, or was it the final expression of freedom? The answer may lie somewhere in between. Even intentional disappearance carries risk. Living without medical care, identification, or support systems exposes a person to dangers that may never be recorded. If Licorice became ill, injured, or victimized during this period, there may have been no one to document it. No records would exist. No closure would follow. There are no confirmed records of her death. There are no confirmed records of her life beyond the early 1990s. There is only absence. Licorice McKechnie became part of a group of people whose disappearances do not fit traditional narratives. She was not taken suddenly. She was not officially reported missing through a single event. Instead, she slowly erased herself from public record. Her story challenges how society measures success, survival, and fulfillment. She reached heights many artists dream of, yet chose a life that rejected recognition entirely. She walked away from fame long before she walked away from the world. In doing so, she left behind a mystery that cannot be solved through investigation alone. It is a mystery rooted in choice, mental health, and the human desire for freedom without limits. The question is no longer only where Licorice McKechnie went. The question is whether she ever wanted to be found. The story presented here is real. documented and supported by verified historical sources. Primary references include the book Be Glad, an incredible string band compendium by Adrian Whitaker, Joe Boyd, and Rowan Williams, published in 2003. Articles written by music journalist Mark Ellen, published in Mojo magazine in August 2000. Recorded interviews with Brian Lambert, released in 2019, discussing his life with Licorice McKechnie, and publicly available biographical records that document her birth, career, personal relationships, and disappearance. These sources confirm that Christina Licorice McKechnie was born on 2 October 1945 in Edinburgh, Scotland, performed as a member of the incredible string band between 1968 and 1972, appeared in later musical projects, struggled with mental health conditions, and has remained publicly unaccounted for since the late 1980s and early 1990s. This is not a fictional mystery. This is a real life that faded into silence. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that forgotten lives deserve remembrance, and if you want more true stories told with care, depth, and honesty, then subscribe to Hidden Truth now, because every subscription keeps these stories alive, and every viewer helps ensure that silence does not erase truth.